Israel killing 1,200 and taking hundreds hostage. You can see now the President of the United States. Let's listen.
It's a very good afternoon, because at long last, I can announce a ceasefire and a hostage deal has been reached between Israel and Hamas. For more than 15 months of conflict that began with Hezbollah's brutal massacre on October the 7th, more than 15 months of terror for the hostages, their families, the Israeli people, more than 15 months of suffering by the innocent people of Gaza. Fighting in Gaza will stop, and soon the hostages will return home to their families. The elements of this deal were what I laid out in detail this past May, which was embraced by countries around the world and endorsed overwhelmingly by the UN Security Council. The deal is structured in 3 phases. Phase 1 will last 6 weeks. It includes a full and complete ceasefire, withdrawal of Israeli forces from all the populated areas of Gaza, and the release of a number of hostages held by Hamas, including women and elderly and the wounded. And I'm proud to say Americans will be part of that hostage release in Phase 1 as well. And the Vice President and I cannot wait to welcome them home. In exchange, Israel released hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. And during Phase 1, the Palestinians can also return to their neighborhoods in all the areas of Gaza. And the surge of humanitarian assistance into Gaza will begin. And the innocent people can have a greater access to these vital supplies. You know, during the next 6 weeks, Israel will negotiate the necessary arrangements to get Phase 2, which is a permanent end of the war. Let me say it again, a permanent end of the war. There are a number of details to negotiate to move from Phase 1 to Phase 2, but the plan says if negotiations take longer than 6 weeks, the ceasefire will continue as long as the negotiations continue. I've spoken to the Emir of Kuwait and the President of Egypt, and we have pledged to make sure the negotiations will keep moving forward for as long as it takes. Then, when Phase 2 begins, there will be an exchange for release of the remaining living hostages, including male soldiers, and all remaining Israeli forces will be withdrawn from Gaza, and the temporary ceasefire will become permanent. And finally, Phase 3, any final remains of hostages who have been killed will be returned to their families, and a major reconstruction plan for Gaza will begin. This is the ceasefire agreement I introduced last spring. Today, Hamas and Israel have agreed to that ceasefire agreement and the whole ending the war. You know, those of you who have followed the negotiations can attest, the road to this deal has not been easy. I've worked in foreign policy for decades. This is one of the toughest negotiations I've ever experienced. And we reached this point because of the pressure that Israel built on Hamas, backed by the United States. Hamas's longtime leader, Sinwar, was killed. Hamas's strongest supporter, Iran, launched attacks on Israel. And those attacks failed after my administration organized a coalition of nations to stop them. And after I ordered the U.S. ships and planes to come to Israel's defense, we also shaped Israel's strong and calibrated response, destroying Iran's air defenses, but avoiding an escalatory cycle of an all-out war. The United States also organized a coalition of 20 countries to stand up to attacks by the Houthis, including their missile attacks in Israel. Then, Hezbollah, another of Hamas's strongest backers, was significantly weakened on the battlefield, and its leadership was destroyed. With our support, Israel negotiated a ceasefire with them, and after that, Lebanon finally elected a new president who's not beholden to Hezbollah, and he can begin a new chapter for the Lebanese people. All told, these developments in the region, which the United States helped to shape, changed the equation. And so now, the terror network that once protected and sustained Hamas is far weaker. Iran is weaker. Iran is weaker than it's been in decades. Hezbollah is badly degraded. And after more than 15 months of war, Hamas's senior leaders are dead. Thousands of Hamas fighters are dead. And the military formations have been destroyed. With nowhere to turn, Hamas finally agreed to releasing hostages. You know, there was no other way for this war to end than with a hostage deal. And I'm deeply satisfied this day has finally come, for the sake of the people of Israel and the families waiting in agony, and for the sake of the innocent people in Gaza who suffered unimaginable devastation because of the war. The Palestinian people have gone through hell. Too many innocent people have died. Too many communities have been destroyed. In this deal, the people of Gaza can finally recover and rebuild. They can look to a future without Hamas in power. You know, the Bible says, blessed are the peacemakers. Many peacemakers helped make this deal happen, including an extraordinary team of American diplomats who have worked nonstop for months to get this done. Secretary Blinken led the effort. Secretary Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, Bill Burns, John Feiner, Brett McGurk, Amos Hochstein, and the Vice President worked relentlessly as we work to deliver this deal. I'd also note this deal was developed and negotiated under my administration, but its terms will be implemented, for the most part, by the next administration. In these past few days, we've been speaking as one team. This has been a time of real turmoil in the Middle East. But as I prepare to leave office, our friends are strong, our enemies are weak, and there's a genuine opportunities for a new future. In Lebanon, there's an opportunity for a future, free from the grip of Hezbollah. In Syria, a future free from the tyranny of Assad. And for the Palestinian people, a credible pathway to a state of their own. And for the region, a future of normalization, integration of Israel and all its Arab neighbors, including Saudi Arabia. At the G20 in Delhi in September 23, I rallied key countries behind a vision of an economic corridor from India across the Middle East to Europe. That vision can now become a reality. There are risks as well, including ISIS and Iran, even in a badly weakened state. But we're handing off then to the next team a real opportunity for a better future for the Middle East. I hope they will take it. Let me close with this. My friend for years in the United States Senate, former Senator George Mitchell, who did so much to forge peace in Northern Ireland, once said about diplomacy, he said, it is a 700 days of failure and 1 day success. 700 days of failure and 1 day success. Well, we've had many difficult days since Hamas began its terrible war. We've encountered roadblocks and setbacks. We've not given up. And now, after more than 400 days of struggle, a day of success has arrived. God bless all the hostages and their families. May God protect the troops of all those who work for peace.
Mr. President, how do you see the future of Gaza now? As you were saying, the implementation of this deal will be in the hands of the next administration. And basically, they will shape the future of Gaza. So how do you see this future? And also, how much credit do you give to the Trump team for this deal? Trump is already taking credit for it.
Well, you know, this is the exact framework of the deal I proposed back in May. Exact. And we got the world to endorse it. Secondly, it's America's support for Israel that helped them badly weaken Hamas and its backers and create the conditions for this deal. And thirdly, I knew this deal would have to be implemented by the next team, so I told my team to coordinate closely with the incoming team to make sure we're all speaking with the same voice, because that's what American presidents do. Thank you.
In the, how many Americans will be released when the hostages are being released?
All the exact detail of how many people are being held, how many bodies will be returned and less, will all be forthcoming. All of it, all of it. Thank you.
This deal will hold.
I'm confident. Thank you.
Books credit for this, Mr. President, you or Trump?
Is that a joke? Oh, thank you.
And there you have it. The President of the United States, flanked by his Secretary of State and the Vice President, Kamala Harris, announcing this historic deal. It is a three-phase deal that will begin on Sunday and will begin the process of returning home some of these Israeli hostages and American hostages and this ceasefire. I want to bring in Face the Nation moderator Margaret Brennan. I know you have been working the phones for days and a lot certainly this morning. Explain how it will work.
So this is a very complex three-phase deal. As President Biden said, this is what he went public with, but it was all aspirational at the time. And let's be clear, just getting to yes was a huge lift. Negotiators were talking up to 3 a.m. Wednesday in Doha. Notably, in the room, Biden and Trump envoys, very much side by side with Israel, but the negotiators couldn't be in the same room with Hamas. You had the Israelis on one floor with the Americans, Hamas on another. They did get to yes, but we are already seeing just how politically complicated implementation of this will be. Some very welcoming statements in Doha, Qatar, from the President of the United States, but in Israel, the Prime Minister issuing a statement saying they need more details. That may be a nod, Nora, to details we'll get later today. The list of Palestinian prisoners who will be released from Israeli detention haven't been made public yet, and we could see legal challenges to it. That's just to say, getting to yes was huge, but getting this to actually work will also be a massive diplomatic undertaking. We don't yet know who Donald Trump will charge with overseeing these details. You hear Qatar and Egypt say on their end they will get Hamas to follow through, but this is a step-by-step process. Yes, in phase one, you should see some Americans, but you won't see them walk out on day one. If the timeline lines up, the Palestinian list comes out today, you could see a challenge go to the Israeli Supreme Court. In the best case scenario, the first release would be by Sunday. You could then see 3 to 4 women released. But this is every few days. A little something here, a little something there. And remember, we were just 8 days into the last hostage deal when it all fell apart. The hope this time is that they can get to phase 2 and 3, and that you could eventually see a full-scale withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza. But that's a really big if. Right now, what we have is an agreement to let some aid in, some hostages out, and some Palestinian prisoners. So this may be a phase 1 deal. Biden, in his legacy, wants this to be seen through, but he's handing that over to Donald Trump to implement. And we'll have to watch just how successful this can actually be. It is a massive deal for him, and he made this big push right after the election. Nora.
I want to get your take, given your level of expertise and speaking with everyone, given that Donald Trump has said all hell will break out if there's not a deal, given that both presidents have their envoys working side by side, does it make it more likely that we could see this through, that maybe we could get to phase 2 when those male soldiers would be released and so many families waiting for them to come home, as well as the women, the wounded, and the elderly that will be part of phase 1?
That's what's been so, frankly, impressive, because it's so unusual to see them working side by side. One team representing the U.S. is the phrase they're using. Donald Trump doesn't want this on his plate. He doesn't want this on his inbox. This has been just such a horrifically bloody and brutal war in the Middle East that has reverberated throughout. He wants to see this through, and that has been really useful, the negotiators tell me, at the table, because the parties in the region do fear that while they can say no to Joe Biden, they know Donald Trump wants it, and that there could be consequences, particularly useful when pressing Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who is politically embattled and under a lot of pressure from his right flank not to agree to pull Israeli troops out of Gaza and actually to annex that territory. Yeah. Trump is pushing back on that. So it's a very interesting dynamic, but we could see implementation. That's going to be up to the hands of the diplomats who are going to be down in the details. That's why we have to see who he appoints. Right now, it is real estate magnate Steve Witkoff, who was there with seasoned diplomats. We don't know who will be there really pressing day to day to make sure that this happens.
So much to discuss. I want to touch base with our correspondents in the region because we have been watching Gaza in Israel and in Israel, I should say, since this deal was announced. Take a look at this, celebrations. This video, you can see people flooding into the streets in celebration. The Hamas-run health ministry saying more than 47,000 Palestinians have been killed since the fighting began 15 months ago. And if this ceasefire holds, it could mean a flood of humanitarian aid into the region. I want to bring in CBS News foreign correspondent Ramy Inocencio. He's been on the ground covering this war since the beginning and is in Tel Aviv tonight. And what are the hostages' families telling you?
Sure, Nora. Well, a statement by the families of American hostages was just released, and it is a mix of emotions. On one hand, they're expressing their gratefulness to the outgoing Biden administration, but they're also expressing anxiety about the future of their own families. You both were just talking about whether this phase 1 into phase 2 into phase 3, whether this process will hold. They are still unsure whether that will happen. And as we know that there are 7 Israeli Americans among these 98 Israeli hostages, and 3 of those are still believed to be alive. We expect, though, that those 3 will not come out over the first phase, over the first 6 weeks. But again, they're hopeful, interestingly, hopeful specifically that under President Trump's leadership, they say that every last hostage will come home. With the people that I've been talking to, the families of hostages, they've been saying that it is also a complicated mix of emotions. One brother of one of the hostages, Eli David, messaged me and said that he thinks that this is, that he's not happy about it because his brother, a male, of course, won't be in that first tranche, in that first group, in this first phase 1. He said that he is, of course, hopeful. He's excited for phase 2, but again, people just aren't sure whether we can get past the first few days, the first few weeks. So still, there has been this kind of hopeful anxiety, anxious hope, if you will, in the lead up to this deal over the past several days. And that kind of anxious hope still carries on until, of course, those loved ones and those hostages finally are able to hug each other again.
No doubt, Ramy Inocencio, and Margaret has some additional details to add to that. Margaret.
So the first American we might see is Keith Siegel, who is over the age of 50. That's the benchmark for military service. He would come out in phase 1 if this moves forward. We just wouldn't expect to see him until about day 7 or beyond. 2 of the others are more complicated because they are of military age. But there are 2 other male hostages, one of them a member of the IDF, that would potentially shift to a later phase. But we could see 2 of the 3 Americans released in the first phase, the first 6 weeks.
Thank you, Margaret. I want to bring in White House reporter Weijia Jiang. And Weijia, we heard the president talking about the extraordinary cooperation between this outgoing administration and the incoming administration. Talk about what you know about that. The president making clear that he wanted this to work.
Well, he's relying on them. He's depending on the Trump administration for this to work, Nora, which is exactly why from the very beginning when it was clear that Trump had won, it was the national security advisors and appointees that Trump had named who were brought into the fold first whenever other counterparts were not even having conversations, and why Margaret laid out exactly why they will be critical in carrying out this plan. And this is an announcement, Nora, that President Biden has been waiting for so long to make. It has been hanging over him. And the timing is fortuitous for him because in just a few hours, he will be delivering a farewell speech to the nation that is also, of course, a final declaration of his accomplishments. And this certainly reframes that, and we expect he will be talking at length about the success of this deal, which he said was the result of dogged and painstaking American diplomacy. But Nora, President-elect Trump has also weighed in, and he says in his statement that this epic ceasefire agreement could have only happened as a result of our historic victory in November, as it signaled to the entire world that my administration would seek peace and negotiate deals to ensure the safety of all Americans. President Biden was asked about the fact that Trump is already taking credit for this, and his response was simply to point out that the agreement that was reached was his exact framework that he introduced in May. And then when he was asked more pointedly who is responsible for this, him or Trump, he said, was that a joke? But aside from the rhetoric and the politics, what matters most is that Biden reiterated that he has stressed to his team to work closely in coordination with the Trump team, because at the end of the day, you're talking about the United States and its place and its role, Nora, in brokering this historic agreement.
Weijia Jiang at the White House. Thank you. So much at stake. More than a president's legacy here, the lives of so many people in the Middle East, and what many people hope for, which is perhaps a transformation, a normalization of relations somewhere down in the future between Israel and some of these Arab states, too, if this ceasefire agreement and this three-phase deal can hold. And so we will continue to cover every detail of this on CBS News 24/7, your local news. And we'll have more tonight, including analysis on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News special report. I'm Nora O'Donnell.
I'm Errol Barnett at the CBS Broadcast Center here in New York as we continue to cover this breaking development as Israel and Hamas reach a ceasefire and hostage release deal in just the past few hours. We understand it will unfold in a series of phases, starting with hostages being released by Hamas as early as this Sunday. We just watched as President Biden tried to accept credit for helping for the U.S. part to negotiate this deal. He says the deal is exactly based on a framework he established in May of 2024. We're going to continue to get reaction from the region and all of our experts. I want to begin first, though, with our CBS News Middle East reporter, Courtney Keeley. She's with me here on set in Studio 57. You have done extensive reporting from the region for many years. I want to first just take a breath and let sink in the significance of the news that after all these fits and starts, we now have this deal announced. How significant is it?
Right, and it's a question of dare we hope? It has been brutal since October 7th. Every side has lost. The civilians have paid the highest cost. The families of the hostages have paid the highest cost. And will this be over? So what I can tell you right now is I'm seeing reports coming out of Gaza from a Palestinian journalist, because no Western journalists have been allowed in. Palestinian journalists being hoisted on the shoulders of regular Gazans, celebrating the announcement of this ceasefire. Amid the destitute, the malnutrition, the lack of aid, they are cheering and they are happy at this news, and they're probably desperate for their news. Israeli families of hostages, it's going to be a long wait till Sunday. It's going to be a long wait till phase 2, and it's going to be a long wait till those remains of family members, deceased hostages, come out in phase 3. So every single step is grueling for everyone involved, and it will be grueling for everyone involved in keeping these negotiations alive. Because President Biden just said, as long as the negotiations continue, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, the ceasefire will hold. I have seen countless ceasefires in my 25 years of experience, starting at the Al-Aqsa Intifada, coming out of being in Gaza, reporting on the ground, of failure. Do we dare hope? And I think we can, because there are so many changes in the Middle East and there are a lot new players. And it's really not about these American presidents. It's really about the complete change in structure and shape among local leaders in the Middle East, too.
And just to give our viewers a bit of additional context, we understand this first phase could take place as early as Sunday, the release of 33 women, children, and older hostages, including those who are injured. In exchange, Israel expected to release Palestinian women and children from its prisons. Who they are specifically is still to be determined. Courtney Keeley is with me here in Studio 57. We also want to speak with our senior White House correspondent, Weijia Zhang, who has just listened to President Biden accept credit for what will be effectively handed over to the next administration come next week. Weijia, what was the main headline from what you heard the president say, really showing a moment of strength with his vice president and secretary of state standing behind him?
Yeah, Errol, this is an announcement that President Biden has been waiting to make for so long, especially after he announced this very framework last May. And so you can imagine the relief and also the acknowledgement that it will not actually be his administration that is carrying out these critical details of this agreement, which he spoke at length about. He nodded to the fact that his national security team was in close coordination with President-elect Trump's because, you know, in 5 days, Errol, there will be a change of administrations. And even phase one of this deal is for 6 weeks. So obviously it will be up to Trump and whoever he delegates to carry out the details in this deal. But, you know, President Biden also talked about how this was the result of dogged and painstaking American diplomacy, I think trying to remind everybody that this is really about coming together as America, as the United States, to maintain its role in brokering what has been such a long journey. And interestingly, he was asked, Errol, about some comments that President-elect Trump has already made about this deal. He posted on social media, this epic ceasefire agreement could have only happened as a result of our historic victory in November, as it signaled to the entire world that my administration would seek peace and negotiate deals to ensure the safety of all Americans. And Biden was asked about Trump taking credit, and he simply pointed to the fact that the agreement we're talking about right now is the one that he put forward. He said it was the exact framework that he introduced in the spring. Then when he was asked even more pointedly who deserves the credit for this, you or Trump, the president answered, was that a joke? But of course, you should always expect there to be rhetoric and politics weaved in. But when you push that aside, what matters even more, Errol, was the president's reiteration that it will be up to the incoming administration and that he has stressed to his own team that they must be in lock and step in order to carry this out, Errol.
And as everybody's laid out, Weijia, it's still very delicate. Margaret Brennan noted that the final terms were agreed to as late as this morning. And I know you there at the White House would know how quickly we got word that President Biden would address the public and take credit for this news. One remark he made, citing what diplomat George Mitchell had told him about, long diplomacy. He said there are 700 days of failure, but 1 day of success. Can you help us understand how President Biden formulated this framework from the spring of last year, the spring and summer of last year, knowing full well that he would be or could be leaving office?
Well, at the time when he introduced it, it wasn't clear how long it would take. And remember, even before May, there were several attempts to have a ceasefire, whether that was going to be a temporary ceasefire leading into a permanent one or not. And even though his team had worked with negotiators on both sides to get to the brink of an agreement many times, they ultimately fell through, although there was, we should say, one period of a ceasefire during which Israel allowed more humanitarian aid to flood Gaza. And then, of course, the fighting resumed. And so when the president introduced this in May, it was always going to be with these details, but the start date was unknown. And it just so happens that the start date is now 5 days before President Biden leaves office. But, in his mind and his team's mind, that is still obviously a tremendous victory for Biden because it happened on his watch. And we should say, Errol, that in just a few hours, the president was already set to deliver a final farewell speech to the nation, which we will carry here on CBS News Live at 8 o'clock tonight. And, you know, this definitely changes his message. 2 days ago, he delivered a final foreign policy speech about all of his accomplishments. Today, he is able to revisit that and not only talk about his closing message to the American public, but he's able to leave them with this huge victory that he can now claim was under his administration. And he named all of the people on his negotiating team who had been at this for so many months, making trips to and from the Middle East, trying to broker the deal that we saw announced today, Errol. But you're absolutely right in that, you know, this is obviously a very delicate situation, and we don't know whether or when phase 2 will happen and phase 3. And so it really just depends on what happens when the Trump administration takes over, Errol.
Weijia Jiang giving us the very latest from the White House. Weijia, thank you for that. And of course, we will have the president's speech live here on CBS News 24/7. Now, let's speak with CBS News national security contributor Sam Vinograd. Sam, here we are finally. We know that you've worked as a former counterterrorism official at the Department of Homeland Security. What strikes me is this note of not just the Biden diplomats who helped line this up and get us here, but the acknowledgement that President-elect Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, was in the room and was part of these talks recently. How significant is that in getting something that can actually stick?
Well, achieving a ceasefire and hostage release deal is one of the few areas that President-elect Trump and President Biden agree on. It is worth noting that since the election, negotiations for the Biden administration have really been colored by the fact that many world leaders viewed the administration as a lame duck administration. Other countries, other parties were reticent to engage in negotiations with the Biden administration under fears that President-elect Trump could come into office and completely reverse any negotiations. Having President-elect Trump's team involved on the ground in Qatar and having ostensibly President-elect Trump sign off on this deal sent a signal to both Hamas and to Prime Minister Netanyahu that this deal will stick when President-elect Trump comes into office. I will note, Errol, Face the Nation host Margaret Brennan made a very important point during this special report that just included. The implementation of this deal is going to be incredibly complex. We know that his Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, will be involved, but I can tell you from experience, implementing these deals takes multiple ambassadorial level personnel on the ground, monitoring implementation, coordinating with aid groups, coordinating with the parties. And we just don't know yet who from President-elect Trump's team will be performing those roles. So we just better hope that there is not a gap in personnel responsible from the U.S. side for actual implementation of the deal.
And we do know that Republican Senator Marco Rubio is Trump's nominee to become Secretary of State. Those confirmation hearings unfolding this week. We should also note, as important as this is for Americans and the Israeli-American hostages who could be released Sunday, the dynamic is not only different on the U.S. side, but in the region too. When you look at Bashar al-Assad now ousted from Syria, when you look at the changing dynamics in Lebanon, can you help us understand the regional picture and how its evolution helped us get here, Saudi Arabia included?
The balance of power in the region could not look more different between October 7th, 2023 and today. We have to remember that Hamas's biggest supporter, Iran, is in a very different position today than it was on October 7th. Hamas itself has been decimated by losses to its senior leadership, including its real leader, Ismail Haniyeh, as well as Yahya Sinwar, who is leading operations on the ground. In addition to that, it's lost so many fighters. Now, Iran was Hamas's biggest supporter with financial assistance, weapons, and more. Iran is on its back foot. We saw that was very evident when Iran withdrew its support for Bashar al-Assad and rebels in Syria were able to take power. Hezbollah in Lebanon has also really suffered catastrophic losses at the hands of Israel, both through covert campaigns, as well as an actual ground war that lasted. So Hamas's actual position in Gaza and backing from its supporters has changed dramatically, and we have to assume that that has been a real factor here in bringing Hamas to the negotiating table and leading them to accept these contours of the deal, not to mention the fact, not that Hamas cares about civilians, but the humanitarian situation in Gaza is catastrophic, absolutely catastrophic.
Sam, stand by for us. Joining us from our Washington bureau, we now want to speak with CBS News Chief Foreign Affairs correspondent and moderator of Face the Nation, Margaret Brennan, the first to report that this deal had been reached. Margaret, help us understand some of the latest information you understand about how the ceasefire will work, because as everyone, and you included, have discussed, the implementation here will be crucial.
Right. You can agree to something on paper, but then you have to see if there is follow through, as Sam was laying out for you. What we know is that there are 7 Americans, at least 3 of them assessed to be alive, who are among those hostages being held. And in the first phase of this deal, which will be playing out over 6 weeks of time, we could see 1 or 2 of them released. There is a 3rd American who was a member of the Israel Defense Forces and therefore considered a combatant who would then be in a later phase of this deal. So there is certainly a focus for some of these families to make sure that this isn't just a one-time prisoner swap for these 33 people, but that it follow through all the way through this complex deal. As I heard Sam pointing to, and it's a great point, the question becomes implementation and who oversees it. The diplomats who negotiated this on behalf of the Biden administration are longtime Mideast hands with deep regional knowledge. We don't yet know who will stay on and join the Trump team that has that kind of background. And why does it matter? You've got to navigate all the complex regional politics. What's been useful in these final days is that unified force of the Biden and Trump teams, because it does suggest that the United States will have a vested interest in making sure that this holds on past this weekend, when we are about to see the change in power between administrations in this country, January 20th. But the long and short of it is that this is a huge achievement to get to yes. We will see if the shifting of troops in phase 1, as described by President Biden, is followed through on. We heard the Qatari Prime Minister announce all the details and really lay them out. This is important for the public record so that there can be an accounting later on. We have not heard from the Israeli Prime Minister a statement of support yet. Perhaps that has to do with the complex domestic politics he has. This deal has to go forward for approval by his own cabinet and the Knesset. The Security Cabinet had already signed off overnight last night, but it still has to go through a process. We also have not yet seen the list of names of Palestinian prisoners who will be released from Israeli detention centers. And that is expected to draw legal challenges within Israel. So this could get complicated on the political front in the next few days. But if it holds, even just through this weekend, we could see some families reunited. And of course, that has huge meaning for those who have been missing their loved ones since that horrific October 7th attack. And for those living in Gaza, they obviously would hope to get to that phase 3 part of this deal, because the peak would allow for 600 aid trucks per day. We are talking about a situation where sometimes there are no aid trucks getting in. And so that has led to catastrophic conditions inside of Gaza and a lot of suffering on behalf of civilians who are trapped there, unable to leave, and under brutal rule of Hamas and in the midst of crossfire. It is just an absolutely horrific situation inside Gaza.
And we've already seen footage from the region of people celebrating this news, certainly a moment for optimism and hope. And to your point about relatives of hostages and other victims, this is a moment where at least they can get a sense that perhaps the worst might be behind us. You've specifically laid out some of the issues and sticking points, chief among them, who in the Trump administration will handle the implementation of this deal. What might be the largest delicate issue that could unravel it all?
Well, there's also just the reality of what's left behind. One of the things President Biden and his team had been asking from day one of the war is what's the plan for the day after? We haven't really heard much of that articulated by the Israeli government itself, because it is so politically heated, particularly in the right wing of the Netanyahu government. Prime Minister Netanyahu is in a tricky political spot. There are members of his coalition who want to annex Gaza. They don't want to withdraw, and they don't want to give that territory back to Palestinian control, period, and believe they have a right based on religion and their personal belief that that territory should be Israeli and not Palestinian. This is a domestic issue he's got to hammer out. That's going to be really complex. You also have the reality of what's left, the absolute devastation inside of Gaza. I have had U.S. officials, and particularly those in the national security space, worry out loud about the radicalization that could happen from those left behind, and perhaps is happening with the reconstituting of Hamas, because there are so many children left without parents. There are so many horrific situations in terms of famine, in terms of injury, in terms of lack of medical supply. What is left behind? At one point, the director of national intelligence, Avril Haines, testified before Congress saying this will have a generational impact on terrorism. For that reason, of what could come out that could be worse, the United States has an interest here in making sure that there is an alternative to the current conditions and the ongoing war. Because the U.S. is so tightly allied with Israel, and U.S. weapons are being used in these assaults. And so the U.S. does get blamed. So there is a risk to the United States that continues through any future administration because of that. So the Trump administration has an interest here. Donald Trump has said he doesn't want this issue in his inbox on day one. He wants the war to end and to be able to move forward.
And all those risks make it even more significant that we reached this moment. Our Margaret Brennan, the first to report on a ceasefire and hostage release deal between Israel and Hamas. Margaret, thank you very much. We now want to cross to CBS News political reporter Aaron Navarro. He's joining us from West Palm Beach. Aaron, we saw a message released by President-elect Trump taking full credit for this deal. What did he have to say, and what can you tell us about it?
Yeah, in the Truth Social post shortly after news of the deal broke, President-elect Trump said that the deal would not have been able to happen had he not been elected this past November. He said he was, quote, thrilled about the hostage deal. He said his team will work with Israel and allies to, quote, make sure Gaza never again becomes a terrorist safe haven. Said he would use this ceasefire deal to build on the Abraham Accords implemented in his first term. But he also gave credit to his envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, a prominent American investor. We know that Witkoff and Biden's top Middle East advisor, Brett McGurk, have been working together to get this deal done, put pressure on Israel to accept the contours of this deal. And Qatar's prime minister in the press conference today even credited the collaboration between the outgoing administration and President-elect Trump's advisor in getting this deal done as a sign that America was truly unified and committed in making this happen.
I just want to make sure our viewers are aware that we expect an update from the State Department at any moment. As soon as that begins, we'll take you there live. Aaron Navarro speaking to us from West Palm Beach. Aaron, we know that Steve Witkoff, as you just mentioned, was the Trump envoy who helped us get here. But as Margaret was laying out just a few moments ago, the implementation of this deal will be crucial to getting to the aspects of rebuilding Gaza and seeing more hostages released. Do we know anything about who President-elect Trump wants on his diplomatic team? We know that his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, has not been announced as part of his administration this time around, despite being quite visible during his first term.
Well, we know that former Governor Mike Huckabee will be in the role as ambassador to Israel, as well as Witkoff expected to have continued presence. But Trump just wanted to get this deal done. Building off what Margaret said earlier in her answer, Trump said as a candidate in April 2024 that we need to get on with life, saying that Israel needs to get this done. So this is something Trump wanted off his plate. It is important to note that implementation of this deal and the road to a permanent ceasefire is going to be on President Trump's desk. So maybe thornier issue ahead of the president-elect in the next coming weeks.
And Aaron, do we know about where we may see President-elect Trump in the hours or days ahead?
Well, we know he's going to be traveling to Virginia and then Washington, D.C. for inauguration ceremonies this weekend. We also know some of the people that will be in attendance at his inauguration: Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk. And we also know that former First Lady Michelle Obama, who did not attend Jimmy Carter's funeral, is also not expected to attend President Trump's inauguration this time around.
All right, Aaron Navarro giving us the latest from Team Trump out of Florida. Aaron, thank you. We want to cross now to the State Department. We understand they've just started to take questions and speak to the press. Let's listen.
Good afternoon, everyone. Start with some opening remarks. As President Biden just announced, earlier today, the government of Israel and Hamas